Chapter 55. That's all you need to know. My favorite trope of all time is enemies to lovers, and today we're going to be going over my favorite books that have that trope. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Angela and I'm the friend of all the good YA book recs and literary lifestyle tips. Today we're going to be going over my 8 favorite books that have enemies to lovers in them. Now, a little preface here that some of these books border on just hate to love, so I'm not 100% sure of where the line is between enemies to lovers and hate to love. I'm not sure if anyone is 100% sure about that line. I think it is very arguable what falls on what side. In general, this is my opinion of enemies to lovers. However, I have seen some of these books considered hate to love before. But again, I think that's the same. I think especially in contemporary, and I love reading enemies to lovers in contemporary, but it's hard to have true enemies to the death in contemporary novels just because the stakes aren't to the death. With that little tidbit out of the way, let's get into what these enemies to lovers book recommendations are. The first one is a very classic enemies to lovers book recommendation, and it is To Kill a Kingdom by Alexandra Christo. I've talked about this book a little bit before on my channel. Basically, why I think this book is enemies to lovers is because the main characters, whoa, this book is like flying at my face. The main characters in this book are a prince and princess from warring nations. So the prince is actually trying to destroy all of siren kind, and our main character, Princess Lyra, is a siren. The main plot of this book is that Princess Lyra goes on a mission with the prince, and his mission is to kill all of siren kind. Catch, she's trying to kill him before he can do that during their quest. So it's super awesome, and this book is actually very piratey as well. So like the prince is a pirate prince. So a pirate prince and a siren princess hating each other and hating each other's different species, and then having to go from that to lovers is super fun. Okay, this is really random, but as I'm thinking while I'm doing these book recommendations, have you ever realized how enemies to lovers as a trope is kind of a spoiler in and of itself? Let's move on to book number 2, which is These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. This book is a Romeo and Juliet retelling, but with a huge twist. Obviously, Romeo and Juliet in the classic Shakespeare tale are not enemies to lovers, but the main characters here are. So this book takes place in 1920s Shanghai with 2 warring mobs, gangs type things. Mobs, gangs, what does she call it? 2 gangs. So in these 2 gangs, there's a boy named Roma and a girl named Juliet. They used to date, but now they are sworn enemies because of the rivalry between their 2 families' gangs. However, when a monster starts mysteriously killing people in the town, they have to work together to figure out what this monster is and how to stop it. So this book is amazing. I love it because it also has kind of that reluctantly working together trope, which I think is super fun. Next up, we have a classic enemies to lovers, and that is the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. If you have read this series, you understand why I'm now holding up A Court of Mist and Fury instead of A Court of Thorns and Roses. Chapter 55. That's all you need to know. This book series follows a human girl who accidentally gets into fae territory. The first book, A Court of Thorns and Roses, is actually a Beauty and the Beast retelling. I don't want to give too much away about who the enemies to lovers are in this book just because it could lead to some spoilers, but this is a really commonly read series, so if you know who it is, you know. And if you do want to follow along on my reading journey of this series, I have vlogged the entire journey of me reading the A Court of Thorns and Roses series, so I will link that video up above. While we are on the topic of the queen herself, I wanted to throw in the Throne of Glass series, also by Sarah J. Maas. And when we talk about queen, we could be talking about Aelin, because she's a queen, but we could also be talking about Sarah J. Maas, the queen of fantasy. So I don't want to give too much away, but I think this is really the book where the enemies to lovers romance starts in the series. This is the 3rd book in the series. The first book in the series is Throne of Glass. In Throne of Glass, the plotline is that the main character is one of the most dangerous assassins in the land, but she's been caught and sent to a prison camp. One day, the prince shows up at her prison camp and offers her freedom if she fights to become the king's champion in a competition. She has to obviously win the competition to get her freedom, though she will still be the king's champion. And not all is as it seems in the dark court of the king. Definitely an amazing series. If you have yet to check out Throne of Glass, highly recommend, and all the books are out so you could easily binge the series. Next and last fantasy enemies to lovers romance recommendation that we have in this video is 6 of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. So I've heard it argued before that the couple I'm talking about in this series is more hate to love than enemies to lovers because they're not necessarily working against each other, but I still kind of consider them to be enemies to lovers. This video in general has really led me to a philosophical discussion and debate in my head about what hate to love and enemies to lovers is. Maybe I'll make a video about that. Let me know down below if you want me to make a video about the difference between enemies to lovers and hate to love, and kind of recommendations for both. Maybe this video has kind of turned into that already. Who knows? But this series is really amazing. It's about a series of people who are trying to invade one of the most well-protected areas in the fantasy world. So it's very Ocean's 11, Ocean's 8, but in a fantasy world. Nina and Matthias, two of the characters in this, kind of have an enemies to lovers, hate to love thing going on. So, moving right along to contemporary. I only have 2 contemporary books in this video. I feel like I can make an entire another video about enemies to lovers and contemporary, although again, some of them might fall more into hate to love. This one is a little bit complicated because it's kind of like hate / enemies to friends to enemies to lovers. There's a lot of back and forth, but it's really great, and it's Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. This book is about the Prince of England and the son of the first female US president, and they accidentally have a fiasco that is reported by international news networks, and they're forced to become friends in order to improve the PR of their families and their countries. However, as they slowly become friends, they have a lot of rivalry situations and then may or may not also fall in love. So again, kind of a complicated book, but in my opinion, it is very enemies to lovers. It also kind of falls into the royalty trope, so highly recommend checking this one out if you haven't already. Next up, we have Our Chemical Hearts by Crystal Sutherland. So this one is a little bit more of a low scale. Enemies to lovers, it's about 2 teenagers who are both rivaling for the head position of the newspaper. Their teacher forces them to work together, which is awkward because they just do not get along, but slowly as they are forced to work together, something more forms between them, but it might also lead to heartbreak. So this is a really great one. I really love the fact that it's set in a high school setting and kind of a more small scale enemies to lovers, just because I think that the grand sweeping fantasy enemies to lovers is amazing, but also seeing it set in a high school setting is very fun. The last book I want to recommend, because an enemies to lovers book would be nothing without this recommendation, is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, the OG enemies to lovers. Not really, because people like Shakespeare and Soi Juana, who came before Jane Austen, had enemies to lovers, but the OG novels enemies to lovers. If you don't know what Pride and Prejudice is about, it's about a girl who lives in a family. It's a very middle class family, and she has 5 sisters. The one really big house in their neighborhood has been let at last. Netherfield Park has been let at last by an attractive unmarried single man, and of course he has another attractive unmarried single friend. From there, basically what happens is that a bunch of drama ensues, people fall in love, people fall out of love, people do everything. I'm really not explaining this well. It's hard to explain your favorite novel of all time. Does anyone else ever feel that way? Let me know down below if you have a hard time explaining what your favorite novel of all time is. I'm also very curious, what is your favorite novel of all time? During all the shenanigans and romance and antics, the 2 main characters, Lizzie Bennet and Mr. Darcy, do not get along. In fact, they have to put up with each other only because Mr. Darcy's friend who let out Netherfield Park and Lizzie's sister Jane are in love with each other, so they're forced to be around each other and in proximity to each other, but that doesn't mean they have to like each other, and they have a rivalry which might change into something else. Again, this is just the most amazing novel probably ever written, so if you haven't picked up Pride and Prejudice, I highly recommend picking it out, especially if you're a true lover of enemies to lovers, because this will kind of show you where the roots of the trope are. Although if you really want to get into the roots of the trope, I'd also recommend Much Ado About Nothing by Shakespeare, because I think that's another great example of enemies to lovers that is slightly older than Pride and Prejudice. That is it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed so much. I would love to know down below what your favorite enemies to lovers recommendation is, and also if you have as much issues as I do explaining your favorite book. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like it and subscribe, because I post reading recommendations videos all the time, as well as other fun booktube antics. As always, I will see you down in the comments and in my next video.